Is Final Fantasy XVI any good? You're asking the wrong question. Depending on who you ask, there's two ways to answer this question. A, is Final Fantasy XVI a good game? And B, is Final Fantasy XVI a good Final Fantasy? The answers are yes and no. So let's start with the first question. Is Final Fantasy XVI a good game? First off, it's beautiful when it wants to be. There's a clear distinction between priority and non-priority scenes, with the former being meticulously mocapped and the latter being simply animated. It can be a bit jarring, and the lip syncing can feel a bit off at times. Honestly though, this isn't really a complaint for me, I just feel I need to mention it to be fair to those who might care. The combat though is really solid. You can equip up to 3 icons at a time, with each icon having a signature ability. These can be used to augment your maneuverability, block, or build up to a larger attack. Each icon also comes with 4 abilities, of which you can equip 2 per icon. As you master these abilities, you can also equip them to other icons, allowing you to further customize your playstyle. Unfortunately, this does not carry over to the larger icon fights. Limited to Ifrit, there is no customization to your loadout, and a lot of fights rely heavily on quicktime events to provide a more cinematic experience. They look great, but the gameplay definitely feels far too shallow. Larger enemies have a stagger meter, which once halved, leaves a short window for extra damage, and once broken, allows for a much longer window to really pile it on. Different abilities will work better at dealing damage or breaking stagger, so this is something to keep in mind when preparing your loadout. The game also allows you to freely refund experience spent on learned abilities, making it easy to experiment and find what feels best for you. There's also plenty of enemy variety, an advantage of the franchise's long history of iconic monsters, with many sporting mechanics that should actually feel very familiar to anyone who's played Final Fantasy XIV. The story is also really enjoyable, with plenty of twists, turns, backstabs, reunions, and the occasional breath of levity.
You've always been a terrible liar. Is that true?
It's not untrue.
Unfortunately, however, one of my few complaints with the game is that it does often take a bit of a tell don't show approach, or more accurately, an imply don't show approach. For example, the relationship between Clive and Jill is really well done, and their scenes together are some of the highlights of the game. But these scenes are few and far between, meaning the bulk of the player's understanding of the bond between them is not their interactions, but simply our knowledge of their shared childhood. I know a lot of people didn't like the constant banter between the bros in Final Fantasy XV, but it really did illustrate the chemistry between the characters, and I feel 16 could have used more of it.
I want to ride my chocobo all day. Can't get it out of my head!
Instead, Clive can go entire chapters, sharing more dialogue with NPCs than his closest companions. That said, any interactions that are shown are very well done, and the graphical fidelity allows the game to lean on subtle body language cues that really sell these scenes. Simply put, I'm not saying they should have done better. I'm saying I wish they'd done more. World-wise, there's a lot of background lore for players to chew on, and the game makes this freely accessible via the ATL, or Active Time Lore. At any point, you can access it to find more information on the people, locations, and events currently relevant to the story. And as you move through the story, these entries will be collected by tomes here in your hideout, so you can go back and review it any time you return to base. Also in your hideaway, you'll find the Arate Stone, a place where you can practice with your newly learned abilities against enemies in a simulation, or replay previous dungeons and boss fights. You can also retry these boss fights in an arcade mode for a higher score to compare your performance to others online. The map itself is set across 4 nations, with each featuring interconnected fields and corridors with various fast travel points sprinkled throughout. These nations are also not directly connected to each other, so if you want to move between them, you'll need to back out to the world map, select a node within another nation, and fast travel that way. Another thing of note is that travel can often feel slow, as Clive tends to jog at a rather leisurely pace. He can sprint, but there's no dedicated sprint button, so you need to hold down run and wait until it activates. It's also worth noting that Clive will only sprint out in the wild, And heaven forbid an enemy aggro's on you, as that will immediately cause Clive to draw his sword. You can get a chocobo to allow faster and smoother traversal, but unlocking it requires a side quest you can't get until about halfway through the game, and its use is also limited to the wild. If you're in a town or a dungeon, you just gotta take things at Clive's pace. In terms of music, there's honestly not that much to say. It's serviceable and gets the job done, but you're not gonna find too many earworms you're going to want to set as your ringtone. In an odd way, this feels almost as if by design, with the music merely setting the tone while the environmental ambience does the heavy lifting. That said, some score choices can feel really odd. For example, hinting at the Chocobo theme without actually committing.
Come on.
Or music that simply does not read the room. I'm not going to go into spoilers, but the dissonance can sometimes feel like this. Side quests too are a bit hit or miss. Thankfully, most of the misses are early game, running fetch quests or killing a few random mobs for locals, while later game quests do a much better job by fleshing out the stories and personalities of your closest allies, or challenging you to hunt down more challenging game. And speaking of dangerous game, Final Fantasy XVI does offer a hunt board that will post ranked challenges for you to, well, hunt down. You may want to keep an eye on this as well, as much of the best gear requires material that can only be found via hunts. So, on to our second question. Is Final Fantasy XVI a good Final Fantasy? Well, that's really going to depend on what Final Fantasy means to you. Is it turn-based combat? Is it an overworld? Is it random encounters? The music? Party dynamics, ATB, job systems, limit breaks, magic and crystals, airships, Sid, Biggs, Wedge, Chocobos, Morbals, Cactuars, Tonberries, Moogles? Or is it the sum of its parts? Fact is, Final Fantasy XVI might not tick every box, but it's going to tick a lot of them, and that's pretty true of every Final Fantasy. It's also worth asking what counts as a Final Fantasy. Most people would obviously include Tactics, but what about Vagrant's story, which also takes place in Ivalice? Does Type 0 count? What about other spin-offs like World of Final Fantasy, Dissidia, Strangers in Paradise, Crystal Chronicles, Crisis Core, or First Soldier? Does it even need the words Final Fantasy in the title? Does the Mana series count, given that it features Chocobos and Moogles, and the first one was actually marketed in North America as Final Fantasy Adventure? All in all, Final Fantasy doesn't really seem to be the issue here, it's the 16. If it had been named Final Fantasy Dominant or Strangers in Paradise 2, we'd likely not be having this conversation. Heck, if it had been Vagrant's Story 2, a lot of people's disappointment with the franchise going action-based would probably be replaced with elation over the revitalization of a dead franchise. If you're not a fan of action combat, that's perfectly fair. Final Fantasy XVI may not be for you. And I'll admit, I miss ATB too and really do hope that 17 returns to it. That said, I still think 16 is a good game and a quality entry to the franchise. If you're willing to give it a shot, I don't think you'll walk away disappointed.
Let's see what this girl can do.
If you found this review helpful, please remember to like, follow, or subscribe, and feel free to comment on any other games you'd like us to review in the future. And if you're interested in finding out more about Final Fantasy XVI's story and lore, but just don't have the time or patience to play it yourself, keep a lookout for our story and lore breakdown, which will hopefully be coming soon. Catch you later.